This patch is wild. Some intriguing nerfs, some fascinating buffs, and a couple that I even predicted. Let's get into it. First up, Lady Deathstrike is losing a point of power. Now, I know one thing people are going to say is, why is Lady Deathstrike getting nerfed? Was she actually that strong? And according to Second Dinner, the answer is actually yes. Now, this does not jive with necessarily my perception or the data on the public trackers such as untapped.gg, but one thing that Second Dinner does have access to is more data. So generally, I will trust that when they say something is overperforming, they mean it is overperforming in a meaningful enough way to actually hit it. Remember this, it'll come up later. Now, as far as Lady Deathstrike goes specifically, I think that this is actually fairly close to a warranted nerf. She was sort of instantly in the conversation for just a card that you would run basically all the time. The one thing that I think this is overlooking is the context of that. Lady Deathstrike was a very good answer to things like Annihilus, to things, well, really kind of just like Annihilus. That's kind of what she was answering most of the time. But, you know, some of the rest of the time she was in a pixie deck, blowing up your opposing Mobius, things of that nature. And specifically being able to answer Annihilus was a decent portion of why she was being run. I'm not saying that her getting nerfed makes Annihilus better or anything like that. I just think that, like, if this card is showing a very high performance rate, they note that it was higher than Annihilus in the Annihilus deck. And I think when they talk about that deck, they're talking about probably the Pixie Mobius deck with Deathstrike, Annihilus, all the good cards in it, right? And the fact that she had a higher win rate in that deck than Annihilus is not necessarily surprising, but it is something that probably does indicate maybe this was actually a nerf that made sense. So losing only 1 point of power, how big of a deal actually is that? I think she'll probably maintain her role as a very good 5-drop. As long as Annihilus is seeing play, she is a great answer to things like the Void being sent over to you, like a variety of other things, really just the Hood being sent over to you. She also kills off small units like Mobius still in a profitable way. If anything pushes this card a bit out of the metagame, it will be the existence of decks that simply ignore the kind of interaction that she is targeted herself at. So what I mean by that is a variety of Hela decks. She kind of does nothing against Hela. She is just a card. And she never did anything against Hela. She was just a card. I suspect that in Annihilus-based decks, she will still maintain her sort of backup Annihilus / conditional win con role, and I think that is a good thing overall. Remember when I said I usually trust Second Dinner's data compared to the data on the public trackers? This is one of those cases where they better have a data reasoning for this, because this does not jive with the experience that I've had of playing Darkhawk and Marvel Snap. It does not jive with any of the information or data I've seen on any public tracker about playing Darkhawk and Marvel Snap. It feels like this nerf will get regarded as sort of out of touch with the competitive metagame, and maybe it is, but I'm not sure this is necessarily the kind of thing that they are aiming at. One of the things that was pointed out to me when I was talking about an unrelated topic, actually, was that Second Dinner tends to look at the top 50% of MMR. Like, not in infinite, just the top 50% of players when making some balancing decisions. There was an answer in the Ask the Devs section on their Discord to that effect. And that would help to explain why nerfs like this are actually happening. If they're seeing that a decent portion of the reasonably invested player base is seeing Darkhawk and Lady Deathstrike at the top of their metagames as easy to play cards that don't really require a ton of investment and just win a bunch of games, and they think, let's take a point off of both of them, I am okay with that. I will also say, there is one deck that I think could be responsible for these numbers. It is, of course, the, collection of cards that we've featured on a few tier lists already. I believe it was originally put together by Gnome. This just like the Rocks and Angela package and Red Hulk deck. It's a pretty good deck. Like, I'm not gonna lie to you, it's a pretty good deck. I kind of will still want to play it after the nerf, and I think it's just a good enough deck that a bunch of good players play it, but it hasn't really sort of made its way out past that group of good players. And so it'll have good stats, but not necessarily the sample size necessary. So I'm surprised that they made this move, honestly, because my instinct with both of these cards would be to let them marinate a little bit longer. But I think one of the things that is reasonable to take away from a move like this is they don't really feel like letting problems marinate. They think that, let's not let problems marinate. Let's just deal with them head on. Now, I do think in that context, there are two green people that perhaps might need a look at in the sense of not letting problems marinate, but there is a green person coming back into the metagame that might be able to deal with them. Yes, the OG green guy that everyone hates, that's LEECH, of course, coming back into the metagame, I think. I think this is a seriously significant buff, and I'll tell you why. LEECH going to 4-2. Now, his on reveal now does only impact opposing on reveals. When you think about what that is in the current metagame, you have a lot of very powerful 5s. Jane Foster, Annihilus, Cannonball. These are cards that are heavily impacted by this card. I think more than anything else, though, the one I'm thinking of trying to hit is Hela. And yeah, I'm going to be doing that. Now, specifically going to 4 is extremely interesting because suddenly you play LEECH, you get the on reveal, then you blink it into your deck. LEECH into Blink is a combination I am extremely excited for. It reminds me of when we used to be able to free roll Thanos LEECH, right? You'd put your LEECH into the Lockjaw, you'd get a vision out of it. It was just phenomenal. LEECH is worse than he was then, but he can deal with things like Hela, and I think having a real check on that deck is a relevant thing to do. Because otherwise, one of the main complaints about Hela specifically is that there are just not really a thing you can do about it. It just is or is not a thing that will happen. And while LEECH still gives them a couple turns to top deck, I think you're mostly willing to take those odds, and you actually have a way to say, I'm going to try to beat Hela with this deck. Let's put the LEECH Blink stuff in there, right? That's very, very cool to me, because one thing that could do is make Hela a little bit of a less easy choice as the combo deck du jour. And that means, you know what deck doesn't die to this? Is every living Tribunal deck, right? You're suddenly in a situation where this card is good against a specific subset of decks, and just it being good against those specific subset of decks will influence how many people play that specific subset of decks. I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by how this card is seeming to be good right now, because hitting all Hela specifically, that's great, but Cannonball goes away. Annihilus goes away. You get rid of an Annihilus the turn they play Sentry, that is as good as it gets. That is game winning, right? And I think having that option in your deck, especially if you are then able to blink it into a very powerful card, is going to be a very strong thing to be doing. It is where I'm going to start building decks in this metagame. Now, is that because I hate Hela? Yeah, I do. I really do. But I'm glad there's an answer to it that I can play now. Maybe I won't end up hating it as much in the future, thanks to LEECH. The remainder of these patch changes fall into two categories, and I am very happy that both of them exist. Category number 1 is, of course, just reverting nerfs that you probably feel safe to revert. I'm always a big fan of reverting nerfs that are now safe to revert, nerfs that were made in specific gameplay contexts, or maybe even in just lower powered metas that are now totally more reasonable as more cards are added to the game, as stronger cards are added to the game even, and I think this is a great one. Psylocke's nerf is a great one to revert. Thanos was the problem. I don't necessarily object to the original attempt at nerfing Psylocke. It actually reads to me as a very smart thing to do to nerf Psylocke in an attempt to hit Thanos, because what it did effectively was hit a card that is only run in Thanos and give them a little bit more time to try to hit other stuff. And I think that was a valiant attempt. Now that they've actually dealt with Thanos, though, this is long overdue. I'm very happy Psylocke is getting her point of power back. I think she deserves it. I think it was a totally fine thing for her to have. In terms of this affecting the metagame, I've seen people playing Psylocke in, actually, I've seen people doing, Ravonna Psylocke stuff that might be a little bit sad about this. Ravonna Psylocke in negative, Ravonna Psylocke in, all of the decks playing a bunch of 5s with Blink and Jubilee and things like that. Maybe they'll be a little bit sad about this. Maybe it's not a straight-out buff, but I think it is. I think one of the things that people get bogged down in when they look at stuff like how cards interact with Ravonna, oh no, it's a 2-2 now, we can't Ravonna it. Almost all of the time, that extra point of power is going to make the card better. Almost all of the time. Now, I can think of very few scenarios where that is not true, because when thinking about stuff like Ravonna interactions, you're thinking about a specific scenario in which you're already pretty likely to win. This is not really contributing to it. You already got your engine going, and you're not thinking about the scenario where, oh, I don't have Ravonna, but that point of power might be really useful. So I think this is a solid buff to Psylocke. I think she totally deserved it, and I think that she is now going to be exactly 0% more problematic than she was at 2-1. I honestly kind of wonder, given what Zabu is like right now, if you could put her to 2-3, and that would be a safe thing to do. I don't know, but it's just something I think about. Another reversion, a reversion of a nerf that was handed out, I don't want to say unjustly, per se, because I do think at the time it was fairly deserved, but Sauron getting a little bit of a reversion because the Shuri Red Skull deck is just simply not really a threat anymore. A lot of the decks that are currently playing Shuri are still kitty-type decks. They're not really playing Sauron. They're not really playing Red Skull. They're playing Red Hulk instead. And I think that sort of speaks to why it's safe to revert this card, because when you compare this card with like other types of enablers, things like Annihilus, obviously Annihilus is a more expensive card, but one of the things that Annihilus does that Sauron never will is turn the downside into an upside. Sauron is a card that turns the downside off if you build around him, and that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you get to turn the downside off of these generally overstated cards, but it's hard to compete with a card like Annihilus in terms of enablers, where it turns the downside, things like the Void, things like the Hood, into pure upside. You are not just getting what you paid for in terms of good rate on that stuff. You are getting far more than what you paid for, because they're going over to your opponent's side of the board. They're getting the negative power. They're taking up that board space, where Sauron is just sitting there moping. And I get it. It's hard to compare a 3 and a 5. But part of me wonders if there's a better way for Sauron to work, where it's like a reasonably sized 5-drop that takes away all the ongoings on the board and in your deck, and like gains power from them or something. Some way of turning the downside into an upside. I don't really know. I'm not a game designer. Like, it's not my job to pitch this stuff, but I kind of do wonder that, like, if they released Sauron now, they would want to be doing something more than turning a downside into nothing. I think they'd be wanting to turn that downside into upside. And I think that in a world where it's okay to do that, I think honestly that is what I would want to have to happen to Sauron. However, I'm not going to say no to a point of power. I just don't really think that this is going to mean we're going to be able to play those old style Shuri decks again, especially in a world where people have figured out that, like, okay, you're doing nice Red Skull over there, dude. I'm just going to hella you. Oh, nice Taskmaster over there, dude. I'm just going to cannonball it. Like, there's a lot of icky stuff that can happen to this kind of play pattern. Shuri especially is vulnerable to Profex Cannonball, and it's just a very unpleasant situation to be in, I think. So, yeah, this is a safe revert, and I think there's probably more to be found, honestly. All right, let's get to my favorite portion of this review, my victory lap. That's right. I pitched in a video I released 2 days ago, but I will say I recorded it like last Thursday, last Friday-ish. So it's not exactly as close in timeline as you might want it to be, but I pitched a video wherein Claw and Ultron were 2 of 5 cards that I suggested buffing. Now, spoiler alert, the next card that's going to come up here is Ultron. Now, my suggested changes were to make the Doombots 2 power on Ultron and then take away some of his power, and to make Claw a 5/6 that gives +6 to a neighboring lane. I don't know if this is a total victory for me, because they did something similar, but they did not do exactly what I suggested, and I want to talk about what they did, why I suggested what I did, and why I think they went the route that they went. So, victory lap time. We got the Claw buff, we got the Ultron buff. I'm a genius, I'm the best to ever do it, they should hire me. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get to it. Claw is going to get that +2 power I suggested, but not on his power. And the reason I wanted it on his power is because I think that makes him a little bit more of a dynamic and interesting card. When he is splitting the power between 2 locations relatively evenly, he is a card that is actually allowing you to contest multiple lanes at the same time. When he's going 4 and 8, suddenly it's a little bit more difficult to make that make sense to me, because it's really just you put him in the location where you don't want the power. You want that 8 power going where you want that 8 power going. I mean, that said, this is a way of making sure that the focus of this card is in the effect, right? This card is about his effect, his giant glove that shoots whatever that is. And if you want to make this card more interesting and impactful, there's a good reason to put that on the effect instead of the power of the card itself. In addition, it also means there's more valid counterplay to him. Because of the way locations work, not letting them have a space to put the claw down is valid counterplay to him. Having the majority of his power go away if he gets Enchantressed is a valid counterplay to him. I think the buff I suggested is likely a little bit weaker than this buff on the whole, but much stronger into counterplay. So this card is going to play a little stronger, but be a little bit more fragile. And I think that that's probably a good way to go, because I think this card is quite strong. I think we're going to actually see some real claw play. I think if you're missing a big important 5 in one of these decks, claw is going to be a really valid substitute all of a sudden. And I think that is exactly what I wanted out of trying to get claw buffed, which is there are a lot of decks that are doing like 5 stuff right now. And I can tell you one card that I want to be playing claw against. That's Cannonball. If there's a lane where it's like, oh, they're going to cannonball whatever I put in here, this guy is suddenly a big deal. Cannonball Profex is in a lot of places. Having real counterplay to it is extremely valuable. I'm excited to see what this guy does. I think he has some real top-end potential. Ultron going to 2 power on the bots was something that I suggested as well, but they again went further than what I would do here, right? So what they did was give Ultron's drones an extra point of power and also keep him at a 6-8, which I think is wild. I was like, maybe he should be like a 6-5 or a 6-6 if we're pushing it. They kept him at a 6-8, and suddenly this guy is, you know, in theory, not in a real world game, but like he's representing 24 potential points of power, plus Patriot buffs, plus Blue Marvel buffs. This guy's good. Like, this is a legitimately good card. One of the issues that I think we might run into with playing him, though, is a lot of the decks that want to play him also want to fill the board up in other ways. So you're like, I'll run Ultron in my Zoo deck, and it's like, well, you're playing Squirrel Girl and Shauna. You probably don't need this guy. So my question is, where exactly does he fit? Where does he make sense? And I find it myself thinking of the old Ultron decks, where it's like, you'd basically just go all in on one lane. You'd go like Patriot, Mystique, Blue Marvel, Ultron, one lane, and then Patriot, Mystique, Blue Marvel would all do their thing. You'd have 24 power in the other lanes now that this is a 2 power bot, right? Or actually, 20. Wow. Okay. You'd have 28 power. You'd have some 7 power drones going on there if you pulled that off. That's really good. Like, 28 across the board. Like, that's a strong thing to do. It's not necessarily, like, super dominant, though. And one thing that I remember thinking about with those old Patriot lists was just how valuable, weirdly as this might seem, cards like The Thing and Abomination were, because Ultron is filling up your stuff, so you need a way to go a little bit taller, right? When you rely on Ultron, you don't want to be a Brood deck, you don't want to be an Absorbing Man deck, you want to be Thing, you want to be Abomination, you want to go tall in small spaces on the board, and then use the Ultron bots to the greatest of their effect. I have not played a deck like that in a year, and I think that this buff might not be able to bring decks like that back into vogue, but it should make them meaningfully more powerful in a way that they can compete with Series 3 players playing them into legitimately good decks, and I think that is an amazing thing to do. So overall review, I think that this patch can be roughly split into 4 parts. There are part 1, confusing nerfs, Lady Deathstrike and Darkhawk, of course. I think that both of those are fine nerfs, and more importantly, they're super minimal. So I don't really care to complain about them. I think that if that's an issue that they wanted to address, then I just don't have the data to critique it. I'll accept that maybe I just don't have the data to critique it. Fine, sure, I'll take your word on that. The second part is, of course, the LEECH revert, which I think is my pick for being the most impactful of any of these changes. Leech going to 4 is insane. Leech going to 4 into Blink is going to be something I'm going to be doing way too much. I fully expect that. Now, if I make a video tomorrow and I'm like, my bad, it wasn't that good, yeah, it's possible, but I'm definitely going to want to try this. It will be where I start. You will be able to see me live on twitch.tv/KMBestMS. Get those drops while you can. The next part of the patch is reversions that probably should have happened earlier. That is Psylocke and Sauron, and I have nothing but good things to say about them. However, I do not think that they will be major impacts on the metagame due to those reversions. Finally, of course, we have the I called it section where I call myself a genius for thinking that Claw and Ultron were underpowered. Yep, I really took a big brain genius to come up with that one. That is, yep, only I could have realized this, truly. All seriousness, I am happy to see them get buffed because obviously, like, when I picked those cards out specifically in talking about cards that should be better and brought up to the standard of cards that are being released now, what I was thinking about was sort of archetypal build-arounds or replacements, right? To me, Claw is a valid replacement for a lot of good 5-drops now, and I think that is a great place to be because a lot of good 5-drops are very expensive, and so Claw, while maybe being worse than them, will let you play those decks that you're still in the process of building. Like if you wanted to play, you know, a Pixie deck, right? You didn't have Cannonball. I wouldn't necessarily say it would be the worst thing in the world to just play Claw instead. Like, it's not gonna be Cannonball, but it's gonna be pretty good. Like, it's gonna be a reasonable thing to do. And that matters a lot, honestly. And I think that that kind of stuff where it's like, this is way worse, but you have it for free, and it is playable, is the kind of stuff that Marvel Snap needs more of. Now, with Ultron, when I suggested it, my thought process was, Patriot, that kind of Patriot, hasn't really been a deck in a really long time. And I want it to be a deck again because I think about how the metagame used to be. All these synergistic decks have sort of fallen by the wayside. The last survivors are destroy and discard, and they're a little bit struggling, and they're the ones who have gotten new cards recently. And I think Patriot is a deck where it's just not an easy thing to make new cards for this deck. And so the only real thing we can do to bridge people from Series 3 into true competitive is make the deck a little bit better. And I think that's what buffing Ultron ultimately accomplishes. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video with me. I really appreciate everyone who comes along on that journey. Of course, gets to this part of the video where I remind you to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.